being set up, I'd like to welcome you all here today for our CBD campus, and I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose lands we have been learning and have been teaching for thousands. Thank you very much for joining us here today. My standard safety briefing in one of our conferences, we always begin with this. In the event of an unlikely event of an evacuation, then we go out the fire exit downstairs, and I think the evacuation point for here is probably that way. Head towards Hyde Park would be my strong advice, and we'll congregate out there. There are bathrooms just out through the glass doors. The ladies' bathrooms are on this side, from memory the gents are around the other side. So thank you very much for that. And then I'll just steal the people back off my sheet. Our first speaker this morning is very kindly joined us, is Tim Jordan, who, as at the Australian Energy Market Commission, as a commissioner. Tim has come to us, even though he's got a full day of commission meetings today, which we're very grateful for. So he'll be here for the first half hour or so, and then unfortunately has to head off. So if you have any questions, I'm sure it's very generous and kind. He will be responsive to that. So I'm just going to hand over to Tim.
That's fine. Thanks, Penny. Well, thanks in particular for the invitation today. Penny makes a huge contribution to clean energy and renewable energy law and policy in Australia. We're really proud. We've had a great lineup of speakers. It's clear from yesterday. Good lineup today. I'd like to add my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, the Gadigal Eora Nation, and my respects to their elders, past and present. I think as we collectively deliberate on the voice this year, my hope is that we can find a path towards a more just future in our relationship with First Nations people. So, topics for today, to the next slide on this one. Three things I wanted to, can I put that? There we go. Three things I thought would be useful to cover today. First, just a reminder of the scale of the energy transition we're looking at in Australia. Then talk a bit about energy market governance and how the various market bodies work, to get a sense of where the AEMC sits and what our role is in the transition. Then I want to talk about some of the big challenges that we're grappling with. So I'll run through that set of challenges there. Okay. So start with the context. So my starting premise is that a decarbonised power system is central to achieving net zero. So we need zero carbon power to achieve all of our other carbon goals. That's the first thing we need to do. How do we get there with the national electricity market? The integrated system plan that AEMO has developed over several iterations is I think, the North Star for the transition. The step change scenario in the ISP talks about a fourfold increase in installed capacity by 2050. So really significant, complete rebuilding of the electricity system. Some of the numbers, we're going to capacity will quadruple by 2050 from sort of 76 gigawatts today to nearly 300 gigawatts. Storage is going to play an incredibly important role, talking about 60 gigawatts of storage, utility scale and distributed by 2050. Utility scale renewables, we're talking about a 6 to 8-fold increase in installed capacity of wind and solar, and distributed resources, consumer energy resources, including distributed PV, are going to continue their relentless march. Now, notice there are lots of changes that are going on here that are very relevant for market design. So that increasing share of distributed assets that are in the hands of consumers, is incredibly important. The share of distributed assets is going to increase significantly. The share of dispatchable capacity on this reading is going to decline over time as it's replaced with a mix of renewables and storage supported by some dispatchable capacity, but the overall share will decline. The physical footprint of the grid is going to change dramatically. So we need geographic diversity to guarantee reliability in a high renewables grid. And so the physical footprint of the grid has to change a lot. And so the approach we take to regulating transmission, for example, has to change. And as coal retires, we have to find a different way of meeting our system security needs. The system security, we'll talk about the capacity to withstand disruptions in the system. And as we move to a system that's largely inverter-based resources, wind and solar, the system security services have to be provided. So that's another big challenge that we face. I think it's really important to remember that this is a massive investment task ahead here in the transition. We're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars of investment over the coming decades. In a really compressed timeframe, we need to move very rapidly. And it's encouraging there are signs that Brookfield investors buying Origin with a very clear plan to deploy tens of billions in the Australian energy transition is a good start. But we're looking at 10 times that over the next couple of decades to meet the step change scenario. We're talking about 150 odd billion for capital for generation and transmission, 80 billion or so of investment in consumer resources. So investment that's not in any sense that's controlled by dispersed decision makers. So it's in the hands of consumers. They're going to play an incredibly important role. And a lot of very small investment decisions need to be made to deliver that part of the transition. Right now, we see planned capital investment of about 30 billion. So that's only about, it's around 10% of the required capital spend. Very long to go. So, how are we managing the transition? What are on the governance side, what are the energy market bodies? Happily, I think energy market governance is a team sport, but lots of bodies involved. The key bodies that we work a lot with will be familiar to you. So the Australian Energy Market Operator keeps the lights on and they do some critical long-term planning for the energy transition via the integrated system plan. The Australian Energy Regulator, as the economic regulator, who also polices the rules and monitors conduct. And then there's us, the Australian Energy Market Commission. Together, we work very closely. We've been coordinated through the Energy Security Board, which is effectively these days the committee of the energy market bodies. It's had its own independent role with Secretariat, driving a very particular set of reforms. At the moment, it operates a bit like a committee of the market bodies, meets frequently and ensures that their work is aligned. We also work very closely with Energy Consumers Australia, a critical body to advance the interest of consumers in the market. And the ACCC plays a really important role too. Governments are very active across the country. One of the sessions yesterday was focused on the increasing role of state governments very directly in the NEM. Ministers are meeting. Ministers coordinate through the Energy Ministers meeting, which is happening frequently after a period where Energy Ministers just didn't meet. And periodically, the climate ministers attend now, so another new forum for energy and climate ministers meeting. The plan is to meet quarterly to really ensure that policy is aligned. And those meetings are very productive. There's a lot of work that's carried forward. A lot of decisions are each time advancing the national conversation. So I encourage people to keep a close eye on the communication from those meetings. They really take things forward. A bit about the AEMC. A lot of you will be lawyers, and I know you're interested in institutional design, so I feel like you'll indulge me if I talk a bit about how we work and the role we play. So we're an independent energy market body. We're actually set up on South Australian law. We've got 100 staff, almost all based in Sydney, who are dispersed around the country, who like to live on the Central Coast, work-life balance. It's just great. I'm one of the commissioners. There are 5 of us, including our chair. We're the statutory decision makers, and we're all on 5-year terms. We're independent, and we're directly appointed statutory office holders. The staff are ongoing career policy makers, and but we serve up proposals for us to consider, receive recommendations for us as commissions to decide on. So we've got 3 policy teams that cover the 3 sort of 3 big distinct areas of reform, and they're supplemented by some engineers. We've got a technical team, we've got a team of economists, we've got a team of analytics people who run energy market models, and we've got a comms team, so what we do is stakeholder is oriented towards talking to stakeholders, and we've got a team of support functions to bring it all together. Our staff have a very diverse range of backgrounds, like people from public policy directly, but also people social sciences backgrounds, humanities backgrounds, economists and lawyers. Those of you who have students, please tell your students about the AUFC, the place to work. We are always on the lookout for talented people. It's a fantastic place to learn about energy regulation. People spend their entire careers in energy regulation, or they go from there into interesting roles in the industry. It's a fantastic training ground. We've got 2 main outputs. We make and amend the national electricity rules, the national gas rules, and national energy retail rules, and we undertake reviews on topics that aren't yet ready for rule changes. So where there's a rule change, it's not where the rule change isn't obvious yet, or we want to put an issue on the table. When we work, we're applying the national energy objectives, which require us to make rules and recommendations that promote the long-term interests of consumers. And there's a list of things we have to take into account. We make rules with respect to the reliability, safety, security and affordability of the energy system. And we're soon to add emissions to that list of things. So for a long time, emissions was the great unspoken sort of 5th factor in our deliberations, but now we explicitly take emissions in our thinking. I like to think of us on the rule change side of our work as a platform for resolving disputes. When people come to us with a rule change proposal, we don't initiate rule change. Somebody else has to propose them. We think that's really important for the legitimacy of the change that we make, that someone else has recommended them. And rule change proponents put a lot of work into rule changes before they come to us. They think carefully about, they often work with our team to devise the rule change proposal and think carefully about the change they want to make. So they've got real skin in the game.
Are you here for the energy law symposium?
Stephanie, can you go on mute, please?
Just to throw your line of thought.
Yeah. I also think we've got that sort of we're a platform for resolving disputes. So people bring to us rule change proposals, and then we're very thorough in the way we think about we deliberate on those collectively and talk to our stakeholders. We also try to lead thinking on long-term issues. And that's particularly through our review work and our work directly advising them. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what issues are coming next in the transition. Our processes can look a bit slow from the outside, and that's partly because we're very thorough, partly because the issues we're dealing with are often very intense. We're trying to reconcile at times very divergent views on really important topics. But we think we provide a platform that's seen as not a neutral arbitrator, but a fair platform for resolving disputes. Our staff are experts at energy policy, but also at stakeholder engagement. We spend a lot of time talking to the sector. We do a lot of work through long publications. We produce consultation papers, directions papers, draft rules, final rules, draft reports, final reports, lots of other kinds of documents to test, to ventilate the issue, to make sure we're capturing people's concerns. And our teams devote countless hours talking directly to stakeholders. We do a lot of meetings at our offices and virtually to engage. And stakeholders put a huge effort into engaging with us. So we get a lot of resources put into helping shape our decisions, writing submissions, meeting with staff and commissioners. Well, sometimes complaining when they don't get the results they want, but it's a very participatory system. So that's the way, that's essential that we hear and prepared to deal with disputes. We've also got industry representatives directly involved in some of our deliberative groups. So we have a reliability panel that has direct representatives of industry. The reliability panel has a special role in setting the settings for ensuring reliability and security of the system. We're very resource constrained as an organisation. It's only 100 staff. There are just too many issues. And people call on us. There was one of the conference last week. We need to be everything everywhere all at once. I wish we could deliver that. There are so many important issues. The way we deal with that is by setting strategic priorities. And we're going through that process again. So if you're interested, we'll be posting soon on the website our view about our strategic priorities for the organisation. We try to do that every couple of years to give people a steer. We're more likely to proceed with rule changes that are aligned to our priorities. That's just because we think that's the only fair way to proceed. We've got to be transparent about where we can put resources. And we take feedback on that. We have to be clear about what we think is most important at the moment. We also think a lot about our authorising environment as a commission. So we're independent, but if we do things that, let's be frank, push beyond what governments are comfortable with, then they can overrule us. They can change the law around us or directly to get outcomes that they think are right. So we think we have a strong authorising environment right now. We're in a good position to make change, that we have the support of governments who are also making change. And the other energy market bodies are also making change. But we have to, we are aware of the limits of our authorising environment. But we talk a lot to governments to understand what our authorising environment is.
So, is it a vote that the 5 commissioners take on a rule change, or how do you socialise that? Because that's quite an opaque process for somebody to submit something as to how the decision making gets done.
Yeah,
that's within the ANC.
I think we should be more transparent about that. We disagree as a set of commissions, and we will argue for different positions right through. We rarely take a vote at the end. We try to operate by consensus, but that's always an option to go to the vote. So other models, like FERC in the US has a very transparent approach where commissioners are writing their opinions.
That's right. That's right.
That's right. But in Eric's, people who talk to us about experience with FERC, that really, it's hard to make progress with that sort of model. So it seems to, rather than encourage progress, it seems to entrench views. That approach would be very wedded to particular perspectives and the public. It's actually less likely to make progress. It's trying to forget that. It's our approach, which is probably less transparent at the distance most people see it. We think, my experience so far is we have vigorous internal debate about all of the questions.
But you don't release your minutes of how you came to the decision. I'm going to raise an issue, obviously. There's also commission subcommittees.
That's right. Sometimes just for efficiency.
Yeah.
Yeah, quickly derailed by question. Just earlier you said you will soon have a climate objective. That's passed already in the government's. Why do you put the caveat that you will get to it, because it passed 6 months ago?
Government's agreed to it. It hasn't gone through. The actual wording is yet to go through. It's got to go through the state.
Oh, yes. So the state. Right. Okay. I'm not a lawyer. So thanks, Tim.
So we are already thinking that it will apply to us today. We will have rule changes on foot that we'll have to take on day one. We already think about it a lot. It's just, I think we'll be a bit more explicit about our limitations. I think it's interesting thinking through what that will mean for all the market bodies. How do we translate the commission's objective into a decision tool that's going to be a carbon promise that's going to apply to regulatory determinations?
Yeah, that's right. So,
how does the regular market activity get? I'm just wondering, as the system gets more dispersed.
Yeah, so in our system, the and the Australian Energy Regulator has these enforcement
Okay.
functions. We write the rules that they operate under, but they have the powers. They take last year.
Just want to announce my arrival.
Recent example would be maybe out of work. As the events of June last year, when the market was by very high prices, so they have powers to compel companies to provide evidence about internal conduct issues, and so they've written it up in a really interesting report about those events next year. They operate in a framework that we.
Now, do you think whichever form it takes, because I'm not sure what we've seen will be the final version, will clash with the energy technology neutrality, dual objective, which is not the same level objective, but I mean, I see it apply.
Yes. So we had a workshop on this very question yesterday. How do we very timely? So as we're technocratic policy people who think about trade-offs all the time. So I think we'll think of the energy objectives as another dimension for trading off against reliability, security, safety, affordability. They're the legislative values that you have to take into account. So I think technology neutrality, we can't be neutral between zero carbon and net zero carbon and meet the climate objectives. So I think that has to, well, we have to be conscious of I think that becomes not the frame that we use all the time. Yes,
It could still, I mean, if you have it's a high level of objectives, then climate commission will basically just put them first and then say, if we want to achieve this, here are our options, and within these options we are technology neutral. It's going to be something like that, but it's going to be much more big.
Yes, that's right.
Looking forward to seeing the first outputs.
Yes, exactly. I mean, in our work on system security, just to illustrate this point. So right now in some regions, in South Australia in particular, the energy market operator has to oblige certain combinations of assets to run at the same time. They constrain them on in order to achieve a secure system in that market. And that's because those assets provide have sort of engineering properties that make the system secure. Right now, though, they're all thermal assets. So one of the things we're thinking about, is there a way of sort of describing the services that those assets provide in a way that allows other assets, may not be thermal generators, to provide those services. So that's a way of, if we can do that, if we can describe those services, then we think that should be a technology neutral way of delivering the essential services that the market needs, and also allowing competition from non-thermal assets in that sliver of the market. If you think about this, these are the sorts of issues we're grappling with in the future world of changing systems.
So, Jim, you started to mention carbon pricing. We've got a bit like that. So what's your thinking there?
So I think it's sort of an open secret that AEMO in the integrated system plan applies a carbon budget to meet the emissions objective in their step change scenario. It represents the proportionate share of emissions reduction for the electricity sector.
Proportionate share is not going to work given the 82% of you.
Well, that's right. So one way of achieving the target is to describe so embedded in AEMO's integrated system planning modelling is a budget, which we understand is translated into a price to run their electricity market model. So there's already a price, it's just not a visible price. There's also, there is a price of carbon offsets. You could imagine there'd be something like a target consistent price that someone might model for a range of different sectors. The New South Wales government has recently published a guide to the price it uses.
So would you use that?
So I think this is where the debate needs to go. I think for various purposes across the market, including things like cost-benefit analysis for transmission regulation, for example, a price would be very useful. So I think that's where the question, our collective discussion needs to go towards what price would be useful, what price is coherent, is consistent with meeting the target and is practically useful for including things like cost-benefit. Don't have an answer yet.
As you said, that New South Wales Treasury paper is really a bit of a breakthrough for Australia.
It sets out, and it offers not just one price, but sensitivities, other prices you might choose to use to test whether your output is sensible. So I think that's probably a good guide to where the conversation needs to go. But I encourage people to think deeply about this because it will be the topic for the rest of this year. I don't know if it's fine.
It's not good. How are you going to?
Keep going.
So Tim, just a question on that. Can you propose new markets as part of your map? Or new mechanism, market mechanism?
So strictly, we can't make a new rule change proposal. So when people come to us with rule change proposal all the time, I think it would be open to anybody to propose to us a mechanism that was just targeted at meeting the emissions objective, whether that be a new market for carbon to apply to the electricity sector, whether it be an emissions threshold, a rule that said effectively emissions above a certain, generators above a certain emission threshold have to retire by this date to meet the carbon target. It could be an emissions intensity scheme, it could be a revival of the National Energy Guarantee, which had a carbon goal. I think it's open to rule change proponents to come to us with any of those ideas, and we'd have to start a rule change process and deliberate on that.
It's probably obviously organisations are more of those positions to sort of see that you can't propose them to as such. There's somewhere that you take it to government.
So it's a bit. I'm overstating by saying we could do a review and then recommend some rule changes that others might put to us. Governments could do it. Governments do it all the time. So it's
Scope of that to say that.
yes, we can review anything. We've been connected to the rules. It's right.
I mean, that's just usually the kind of flagging it out and clear that. Can someone propose this here, please?
Yes.
I mean, that's
So on the carbon, is it laid out multiple solutions? The person came for one solution. So it's very that solution to reject it. As well as those are new process. Is that allowing you to consider other solutions or
yes, I think a review would be preferable. So we could look at all the range of if someone came to us with a very specific rule change, we can make the rule they propose, or we can make it more preferable. We can make it preferable. We think it does the job better. This achieves the outcome of the different means. In something as complex as setting emissions goal for the electricity system, it would. I think it would need to be something that would move collectively reasonably slowly on and think about the range of alternatives to invest. Better done in concert with governments. Otherwise, we'd face being.
Would you need to move slowly, like the cost-benefit analysis, the Treasury? That's a pretty detailed review, and then you couple that with the federal safeguard mechanism. That's a price on carbon. Do an average them, or you just go to EU straight away, or do what the IEA says. So why would you need to move slowly? We know we need a price on carbon.
We do. I guess we need to. We look at governments giving us this function of thinking about emissions as a way of taking emissions out of the political realm and into the technocratic realm where we operate. I hope we're at the point where it's reasonably straightforward, but I worry that it's that's why it hasn't quite.
Not quite. That'd be correct.
Just on that, how second. With this action.
Yeah, absolutely fair. I mean, I think it would be very helpful for us if governments decided what share of the emission reduction tax has been done in each sector. That would give us, that would be really,
Wouldn't that be a prerequisite? That would be one.
it's very hard to,
Yeah.
we would have to make assumptions. So it would be that.
So if the Climate Change Authority, though, took what you just said, they create the budget, work out how we're getting to 43, and then we get to 75 by 2035, should the government decide that. They set that platform, they incorporate the 82% renewables. That's something you could then interpret and get around Tyson's.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if we had a very clear guidance. If the energy minister sort of there and said, this is the goal.
That's safer.
Perfect foundation.
Just on that, how are you interpreting the secondary speech of the national? Carbon social consideration should not be part of things, and that section of the old fractional objective, and even with these amendments, I mean, considering emissions targets, economic efficiency objective. Is this still something the agency considers?
Yeah, question. I hope we're not getting, are you flagging the judicial review? Yeah, it's really interesting. Reflect on that. I think that we, I mean, yeah.
Can I give you a lawyer's answer to that?
Yeah, sure.
Like, statutory interpretation 101, like, if the second reading speech comes way down, you are like first looking at the purpose of the law overall, and if this is changing, we can absolutely take this into account. I mean, so yes, judges do look at second reading speeches, but for something that happened for that we've since made changes in Parliament, I wouldn't be too fussed about that.
So what is the?
I just started on that.
Sure.
I think that, consumers will put their speak for Parliament.
Yeah.
And we update the NEO, it will be an updated secretary. So I think what's in the secretary speech will be saved for Parliament.
Yeah.
Speaking of one thing, the question. So, I mean, we have felt empowered to prioritise social legitimacy of the energy transition in one respect. So we're thinking at the moment about the enormous task ahead building transmission in regional Australia. The success of that transmission investment in part depends on the social licence of the transmission networks, and each development needs to have community buy-in. So we're encouraging the networks to front load investment in social license really early in that transmission development process, because we can't achieve any of our other goals unless the transmission is built and the communities are resistant. We fail. So some issues that seem tangential become essential to thinking about the achievement of our core objectives.
This is difficult to separate out what is negative issue on the social.
Yes.
Does anyone have a last question for Tim before he dashes off to his commission meetings for today?
So just one last thing. How many, just to talk about, how many proposed rule changes that you actually accept for the relation?
I don't know. I think we have at least 20. Take a bit of investment to prepare so that they're not flooded with them.
And how many get through of the 20? Roughly?
There'll be some that go to the bottom of the pile because they're just not aligned to our strategic objectives. Sometimes people will make a rule change and disgruntled proponents will come straight back with an amendment wanting to change straight away, and they will have to deprioritize those and I don't know what the ratio is. I'd say we're operating on a third of what's going out on.
And the squeaky wheel gets a grease.
I hope not. I think we're.
So it's only some. But that's like.
It's all on their website and look at stats.
No, I know. It's there. It's just, I'm just getting a sense of what the background is to sort of lobby the AEMC for, for rule changes.
Just donation for 20 more
Just to Tyson's point yesterday is that obviously there's, we've got a lot of wood to chop here. How do you get all of the stuff in front of the AEMC to get to the executive, and it's going to take too long, right? How do you prioritize it?
So when we go out with our strategic priorities, please tell us if we think we're having a good mark, because that's the best chance to tell us.
Will there be a submission process? Will you doing a lot of draft submissions to our strategic priorities?
We will.
Yeah, that's.
Please, really appreciate it. We're extremely well placed to think about the overall.
Please join me in thanking Tim. Where would you like to present? I'll probably come up here if that's all right. I've got a clicker though, so you don't have to use the keyboard. So our next presenter this morning is Natalie Lonergan, who's our partner at Spark Involves. And in my opinion, which is a great result, is one of the top oil and gas employees, both in Australia, but particularly in Sydney. Natalie is the go-to person for anything oil and gas, offshore CCS, offshore, anything really. You want Natalie on your team. So Natalie's going to be presenting about offshore CCS and some of the challenges she's seeing in the market today.
I think the biggest challenge is presenting from a gas lawyer presenting at a renewables. It's all green. So but it's actually the color of the crude oil. Yes, and because I'm a gas lawyer, what a number of my clients are actually transitioning to renewables. So what they're focusing on is that they've all been around the world, and you see all of these declarations by major global companies like Total and Shell and BP, not Shell, but stating that they're going to get to carbon neutral, is usually the word, or net carbon zero by 2040, 2050, which, if you unpack that, is highly amusing, given that they all have shipping lines, and the ships are run by the dirtiest, filthiest crude products that you can imagine. And in addition to that, most of them have, actually all of them, have interest in LNG projects and expanding those LNG projects. And if you look at actually the metrics of the amount of how oil and gas is going to deplete, and even coal is going to deplete as an energy source, and renewables are going to increase. In the next, at the moment, renewables globally are about 8% of the mix. If you look at the trajectory, and I should have put it on the graph, yes, the renewables story is a really sharp thing, whereas all of the others, so you look at coal, it's going down, but LNG and oil and gas is still going up. It's creeping up, and they're, for the next week, it's sort of been mapped out until 2050. So it's going to be around, so you've got to accept it, but how do we live with it? How do we decarbonise it? And how do we get
as a country and get to net zero. And in my opinion, the only way that we can get to net zero is by carbon storage. You can plant as many trees as you like, you can do all these other carbon abatement strategies, but unless you actually retire the CO2 molecules, it's still going to be in the atmosphere, it will still be repeated, and we're better to do it. And I'm about to show you, I'm not a lecturer or an academic, so I'm about to show you a project that I'm working on, which is an offshore, that you know about, but it's an offshore carbon capture and storage project. We're getting there. And it's actually application number 1. So it's the first of the project. It's still got, and why I was interested to share it with you and talk to you about it is I'm in a room of academics. There are still a lot of news. Recently, this project's in Western Australia offshore, and recently some new legislation, some new amendments to the Petroleum Act came out. And unfortunately, they don't address all of their issues. And some of the issues that have been putting me in the face, right, and you and others in the face, right, from the beginning, it defies logic. I didn't even consider these. So these are, and I'll get to those. But yes, so that's why and I've got a pretty picture of this project on my next slide. Yeah, no, just the next one. Yeah. So this is the project. It's called the Midwest Clean Energy project, and I'm going to give you a case study on it. However, I'm not going to cover all of this stuff to the right of the screen. All I really want to talk about is the carbon capture and storage project, which is there is an existing gas processing, offshore crude oil processing facility. It exists. It's about 10 kilometres off the coast of Western Australia near Geraldton. That is currently a crude oil field, crude oil area, which, and as if you'll understand how oil and gas is actually comes underground. It's not actually been swimming oil, it's in the rocks. So it's some geological strata where they've been drilling, pumping out crude oil now for decades. So it's almost empty. There's a number of areas, particularly off the coast of Western Australia, that have sort of a similar geological formation that would enable this. So, what the proposal is, and they're very close to getting their this declared as a storage formation. Once that's declared, they can let us for their injection license to inject carbon dioxide into it. At the moment, as I said, this is still producing oil. The oil is there's 2 pipelines there. One is a water pipe that goes in to help flush it out. The other one is a crude oil pipe that goes out. On top of the, and the reason I'm explaining this is it's very relevant to the project. So then, and on the top is some infrastructure which processes the crude oil, takes out all of that and basically sends it to shore. This at the moment exists, and that at the moment is a processing facility for the crude oil and some associated condensate that comes out of that well. So what is happening? What they've applied to do with the Speed of Life, and this is something that, and I guess part of the reason I wanted to raise it as a case study is NOPSEMA still hasn't got their head around it. Tina's advising NOPSEMA, which is why she's given.
I could give you my opinion, but I'm not seeing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So NOPSEMA still hasn't got their head around it. One of the strategies for in-reservoir sequestration one of the rationale for it is that these reservoirs have got very secure cap rocks, usually a limestone, that has been able to hold oil and gas in situ for millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. So it makes it then a perfect reservoir once all the necessary tests are done to prevent leakage and as a way of permanently storing, rather than potentially finding some other storage source. So, I lost it.
Here it is. There we go. Okay, look at it work hard. There we go.
No, that's okay. So, I think I've got the order. So basically what the carbon capture and storage project, so we're hoping to be able to inject CO2 into that reservoir by 2026 at the latest. At the moment, we're in discussions with a number of actually European companies that are wanting to, and I'll get to the issue around the London Protocol on that a bit further down, but who are wanting to basically ship European CO2 and inject it in, and that can be done in the site or a gas field. So what, as I said, it's a permanent CO2 storage in a depleted offshore oil field, and it's because it's so far offshore, there is very much the ability to actually take import CO2 from Europe or Asia or anywhere else, and basically inject it directly without the need of ports and things like that. That's an offshore facility. And then part of the next stage of this project is because there are other assorted renewables projects that they're looking at exploring, but the bottom line is there'll be a crossover period where they're producing crude oil as it's flushed out. So as you inject water in, the crude comes out, but at a period of time during the flush process, there'll still be crude coming out, which can be used in the production of ammonia or hydrogen.
So, sorry, what you're saying is if you injected the carbon with the carbon dioxide, actually get better performance of the oil well itself into its.
Only for a short period of time.
For a short period.
Only there, for a short period of time, it could be used to transfer the process, but that is not the intention, and that's something that not seen as.
I'm saying I can't actually get their head around the fact that as you're injecting, the pressure will cause EOR, enhanced oil recovery, which is a petroleum process and not associated with CCS. So it says effectively, unless the reservoir is clean and you're not producing anything, then you can't put carbon in.
Oh.
So obviously they can't get their head around the concept that injecting carbon will have a beneficial, and in fact the ACCUs are set up the same way. At the moment for CCS.
Yes, and so, and the thing with this project, and the reason I'm doing an associated hydrogen or ammonia project is that as you are, even at the point where you've got what's considered clean or almost clean reservoir, as you inject CO2 in, I'm sucking water out because it's not empty. So the oil molecules get replaced by water molecules as a pack. So that's also complexity of the pipeline, which I'll get to next. So because the water's coming out, the water obviously is tainted. So it will have some taint of crude oil for probably decades. So it can't be clean. It's always still going to be polluted. That type, but there's not sufficient hydrocarbons being produced at the point in time that you're injecting CO2 to have a viable hydrocarbon project. It would be enough for hydrogen.
Before you move, you're labelling of those CCS, it's not a CCUS.
No, it's
because it's enhanced oil recovery.
No. Only for potentially 3 months, if that.
You just said for decades.
No, Yeah, I said it would be tainted for decades because you obviously can't get in there and remove all the traces of crude oil from the rocks. For that.
So what sort of carbon intensity are you talking about?
Carbon intensity later on coming out of the water.
Blue, you call it blue hydrogen. What's the carbon intensity of hydrogen?
I have no idea. I'm not a scientist, but I understand that it will be very low and there will be at some point, you might be able to
I can answer that question for you. So essentially it will be within the parameters of what NOPSEMA calls a discharge fluid from a well, but it will not be high enough to cause to go over their sort of requirements in an EP environment plan. And so it will be within the parameters of normal produced water from a well. So it is not a problem, but it is a problem. In a petroleum well, it would not be a problem. In a CCS well, it's a hurdle. We won't call it a problem, it's a hurdle that NOPSEMA is still getting its head around. That how can you have, just like you've asked, how can you have hydrocarbon molecules coming out of a clean CCS well? And that's because of essentially.
I'm sure they do. So that's why I'm just questioning your labelling of blue. Blue needs to be defined. You need to have a carbon intensity under the Australian hydrogen accreditation scheme that the government's working for. So you actually have that. Have an answer as to how
potentially we may be going away Europe style where they're just losing all labelling and just referring to it as hydrogen.
No, they're not. They're introducing a taxonomy that says you actually need to define the carbon intensity.
Oh, okay. No,
and that's why Woodside rejected the European taxonomy because it actually precludes these sort of projects unless you can actually define it.
Yeah, Europe has a number of these projects already.
But you can't then call them clean because clean implies low carbon.
Yes. Well,
this is low carbon.
It's very low carbon.
Yeah. And this is the problem with the labels. Sorry, the problem with the labels is NOPSEMA says this isn't green, this isn't blue. It says, I don't know what this is, and we don't want to put a label on it because we don't want to even deal with hydrogen. And this is part of the problem is that there's no legislation for hydrogen. There's no consideration of hydrogen. There's no idea of co-location of hydrogen in the offshore space. And so NOPSEMA is just burying their head. They've got petroleum silo, they've got the CCS silo where we go, oh, I don't know what we're going to do with CCS. Then they've got the offshore electricity silo, and hydrogen doesn't fit in that, which it actually spreads across all of those. And so the regulatory issue with NOPSEMA is that this produced water from the reservoir, you're right, absolutely correct, that we've produced it for decades, and you can utilise that water within the process, but there's some carbon molecules in it. The question then becomes how much of it, there's probably, it would be the equivalent of dirty water from radioactivity from aluminium plants and that sort of stuff.
Stayed on the stuff.
But although, yeah, and the Nazis don't want it. But yeah, it's a really difficult area, both geologically, which is the angle that I'm coming from. And you're right, it's going to be decades at the very minimum, and this is a small reservoir, which is why there is a discussion about using saline aquifers on land that are basically clean aquifers and using hypercritical CCS. It's just much easier.
But it's also why NOPSEMA and NOPTA are putting so much time into this project.
Yeah.
Because it's the first one and because it's small and it's sort of manageable, we're working through the needs with them as we go.
But there's brilliant numbers at the bottom. To get anything like that, that's
right. They will.
They will.
They will. There's absolutely no doubt that they will. If you look at it.
If they don't go broke in the next. And so these are I've just pulled out four of the challenges. Obviously, the answer is probably broader than that. But there's a number of challenges, but in the interest of not boring you, the biggest challenge that I've had today is we've got incomplete, and very incomplete regulatory process. So we've got, and also the problem with this project is pipelines. So the actual project is in Commonwealth Waters, but the pipelines which form part of this project and are very relevant to it, basically halfway along their length, they're in state waters. So you've got two different regulatory regimes there that are now trying to talk, but they haven't quite got there. So at the moment, the Commonwealth Waters bid is the Offshore Petroleum Gas Storage Act, which is always fun. And my clients are we've got their application for declaration of storage formation. We've been told by NOPTA and NOPSETA that should be granted by August. We've been doing this now for 2 years. This is how long it's taken.
The review must be September last year, or September.
Yeah.
They had originally then said 90 days, didn't they?
Yeah, it's August.
I thought it'd be great. I've been sick for a few months. I thought it'd be great.
August. And then we've already been told we're eligible for the injection. So the big issues are the pipelines. So one of the issues here, why we're working so closely with NOPSETA and NOPTA on it, well, apart from that, there was the current regulators, but also DEMERS, who's also a regulator. And that's another issue. DEMERS doesn't want to know about it because until recently, DEMERS had no ability to even consider carbon capture and storage. There's an amendment bill out, which is currently up for submissions that end on the 14th of April, that DEMERS put out, which is an amendment bill to the petroleum, the onshore petroleum legislation. So, and I'm going to get to the things that haven't you seen that?
And it's PSLA as well, rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so I'll get to some of the issues in that shortly. So, effectively, so the issues that we have, the main issues with the current lack of legislation is that there's no guidelines at the moment. So it's very hard as a lawyer to advise a client on a new project with new legislation where the regulators aren't even completely sure of what they're doing without having guidelines to follow. So we don't have those. The other issues with it is that at the moment, the way the legislation works is both for the Commonwealth legislation and the state legislation, is that at the end of a petroleum tenement, the life period of that, whatever it's being set at, the decommissioning has to happen. So any infrastructure has to be decommissioned and it has to be completely removed. So at the moment, the rehabilitation obligations, both onshore and offshore, is at the end of the life of the permit, everything has to go and everything has to be cleaned up, which is problematic for a lot of these projects. My clients obviously do, looking at this very small one, but then you've got the giants like Woodside in particular, who's eyeing this off and saying, great, you guys can get this through. We've got a number of, and Exxon actually in Australia looking at this as well. We've got a number of old processing facilities, offshore processing facilities, wells that we haven't plugged and abandoned that are still sort of just there, we just got, that we could use as a offshore carbon capture and storage project. So this is why this particular project is relevant and important. If we can get this right, then all of a sudden there'll be a massive slew of CCS projects in the offshore that are basically reusing existing infrastructure that is capable of being reused. And it'll also, from an environmental perspective, there is a significantly less disruption to the seafloor than if you have to, because mostly when you plug and abandon a well, you actually have to go down. So what the regulations at the moment require is that you effectively have to control out these wells. Remove everything at base level, causes huge disturbance. So this is the solution, and it's actually quite a good solution. for one, dealing with the CO2 issue, two, dealing with the trying to protect some of the environmental issues associated with these, and also protecting other groups such as fisheries who would be completely disrupted in a plug and abandon operation. So for a long period of time.
So now, this question, you had a slide where you showed the economics. I'm assuming those are blue hydrogen economics. It's, you know,
Yeah.
like what's a comparable green hydrogen? I mean, you were saying $400 a tonne for ammonia, double that, triple that.
As in the cost of doing
The cost of,
yeah,
the cost of product.
yeah. So I'm also looking at a green hydrogen project with this company and also with another gas company on the east coast. And to be honest, we're actually just looking at it as a way of being able to declare net zero, because it's actually going to cost a lot of money to produce at the moment. So technology will get up there, but it just hasn't yet. So, and blue hydrogen is not commercially viable.
What sort of carbon price you need to make this project for?
They've got
green?
a group called CO2 Tech working on that at the moment. So, but at the moment it's not so from an injection of CO2 perspective, it's viable. Basically, they're looking at pricing of $5 a kilo of CO2, and that makes it quite viable. But from the actual production, associated production of hydrogen or ammonia from the produced water, at the moment that's not commercial. But it's a factor that may actually be important to actually be able to get approval. So it is one of the factors that not very much Silver and the clean energy regulators are discussing with a view to will we approve this or won't we approve this?
Because it's no method yet. So,
Which makes it very
and this isn't connected with it either.
no.
Because it's not a new project. The ACCU methods are just
So is it $5 a kilo?
Yes.
$1,000.
Yeah, $5 a kilo.
The carbon price of 50 or $100 on $5,000.
$5 a tonne. Anyway, yes. No, I've
That's
got
just-
another.
No, $5 a tonne, and I think the price of hydrogen price is calculated about $20 or $25 a kilo,
Yeah.
which is going to get down to the stretch goal, is $2 a kilo. Yeah, so it's $5 a tonne, which is well under the stretch goal of $20 a tonne per CCS.
Yeah.
With the CO2 sequestration, and then it's $5. No, it's $20 a kilo, which is 10 times the stretch goal of $2 a kilo for hydrogen.
$20 a kilo is not going to give you ammonia at 400.
No.
Give you ammonia
No, I think that ammonia is
Yeah, it's completely, the numbers are completely off. I'm talking green.
Yeah.
Yeah, the numbers for green are just off the chart. It's not viable.
Yeah, but blue's not really viable.
You're putting a 400, or you're saying there's no pricing of carbon in that?
At the moment, they're in commercial negotiations with a number of companies looking to inject CO2, and so once we get an idea on that, that will give us an. At the moment, the range is. So the petroleum legislation amendment bill is the Western Australian state legislation, and it's basically the intention behind it is to put in place a similar process to the what the Commonwealth covers in relation to the storage and sequestration of hydrocarbons. And part of the intention with this was so that not so much this project, but more the Woodside projects, which are further up north, further up the coast in WA, are able to start considering projects like these as well, because a lot of that is more in the Western Australian state waters than in Commonwealth waters. So this is effectively DEMERS trying to do its bit about getting on board. But the big issue is, and this is one of the main problems that we have with this, is in neither the Commonwealth legislation or the proposed Western Australian legislation have they dealt with the conversion of a petroleum pipeline to a greenhouse. So I mean a CO2 pipeline. Effectively, so the engineering aspects and the science aspects are assuming that a petroleum pipeline was able to carry CO2, the legislation doesn't. So basically there is no, the obligation still remains, and this is the big issue that needs to be addressed, is that at the end of the permit, you cannot have a greenhouse gas licence and a petroleum licence process. So one can devolve into another. So the deduction, you can't have them, at the moment they haven't dealt with the overlap.
And they can't deal with either, they can't think of ditching. So you can have one area that is carbon sequestration area and then an area that's say below, a formation below that's actually still producing. You can't do that in one licence area. So they're actually completely different formations, but you can't actually be doing both at the same time. And that is really problematic for, basically good oilfield practice and for reservoir usage and national interest and a range of things.
Particularly as part of the problem is that some of these petroleum licences are massive, absolutely massive, and within the particular area of the petroleum licence, you could have a number of different geological formations, even in different parts of the planet, but also different stratigraphic layers. So it is problematic. So this is something that we're not seeing that, and DEMERS are still working through. How do we deal with this? In the case of this particular project, what we're wanting to do is actually change. So we want to be able to use exactly the same pipelines, and I've actually put up the little company that's doing this is a company called Pilot Energy. This is their project, and this is actually their slide. So this is one of them. So we're currently working through some of the issues, but and what they've said there, and it's too much words, so don't bother reading it. But in short speak, what it's about is the access ways, which are the pipelines, that the government isn't taking into account, just transferring the obligations potentially, a review of the pipeline to see whether it can be upgraded or whether it's multitasked or repurposed. So there is no ability under the legislation to allow that. So this is something that not just this particular company, but Woodside actually is being quite noisy about it as well. They want the ability to repurpose. With this project, at the moment, the crude oil goes onshore and water goes from onshore to offshore to basically help inject the crude oil out. Part of what they're proposing doing is transferring the flow. So CO2 will come also from offshore, but also from onshore through the pipeline, and water will be sent out into tailings dams or ahead of going into a hydrogen project. So that is that's probably the key issue, I think, with the legislation.
And that's this project.
Yeah.
The bigger project would be inside and the light would be the formations just the levels.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a huge issue because the big issue.
Yeah, they're already talking about that.
And part of the problem with learners is the fact that they just have in greenhouse gas, which is a legacy issue. The government inject greenhouse gases controlling that.
Yeah, so I think I've already talked about that today. And the last one, sea dumping. It's such a bad terminology, but this is the London Protocol. The biggest problem, and you're all lawyers, and I'm sure you're probably all very well aware of this particular piece of legislation. So I'll get straight to the issue. The big issue is the 2009 amendment, which basically allowed for sequestration of CO2 in the sea, in a petroleum reservoir. And the 2004, which basically allowed CO2 from another nation state to cross borders and be injected into someone else's sea reservoir. It's not ratified. So at the moment, they've put some sort of interim measures in, but technically it's illegal. Australia is now, so it's the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water is basically working with with the other international bodies in relation to this to try and get it resolved so that at least from Australia's perspective, we can import CO2 into Australian waters and we can inject, which is one of the, which to be honest is probably market. So this company in particular has already been approached by Asian companies and by European companies who would like to send their CO2 to Australia and inject it in this project. Obviously, international sea dumping across borders is already happening in the Northern Lights project. So we just have no protocol for it. There's no law in force.
We're just doing legal advice.
Yes. Yeah.
It's an absolutely enormous market if it was done. That's backfilling LNG tanks, bringing them back home, dumping CO2. What sort of ballpark price are you talking about?
Yeah, no, sorry, I can't help on pricing.
Okay.
I think I've demonstrated that.
Okay.
But yeah, so you're quite right. And so there's a couple of companies that are actually looking at it at the moment. So there's a joint venture between Mitsubishi and Mitsui Alliance at the moment. And what they've created is a ship that can take CO2, well, very creative, a ship that can take CO2 in one direction, liquefied CO2, and then they can take a load of either liquefied hydrogen or LNG. No, they can't take those two companies. Yeah, or liquefied hydrogen. And in one of the ships, they're also exploring ammonia, liquefied ammonia.
But such a ship doesn't exist.
There's a prototype. So there's one prototype that Mitsui Alliance and Mitsubishi. I can send you some information on it.
Yeah, it's a little free pilot sitting on top of the ship. It's not a prototype ship.
It's very heavy. So they've already, Mitsui Alliance has already done a experiment trying to transport liquefied hydrogen.
Yep.
So that wasn't terribly successful. So this is why they're now looking at potentially other fuel sources that, apart from LNG, is very different. What else would they need?
You said you can't put LNG. You can't put LNG in a CO2 carrier, or the other way around.
It's tricky. I suppose you can, but then it causes. It depends on where you're shipping it to. So
they're going in the Northern Lights project. They're going to use them for LNG ships, CO2 transport ships. But then the the thing about Northern Lights is it's a very small geographic area, technically. I mean, it's only around Europe. I mean, it's lots of countries, but it's a small area.
Yeah.
We're not talking cross ocean transport.
Yeah.
But they are definitely using dedicated CO2 carriers.
So
So no cross contamination. So a number of it's Japanese companies at the moment that are exploring this, but there's a company Nixon in Norway, which is a Norwegian company, and they are actually developing CO2 carriers, just standalone CO2.
And ACCA is looking at CO2 carriers across the sea route. They're at Finland's building a prototype with a built-in icebreaker on the AS650.
Yeah, so finished. So does anyone have any questions? I know that was sort of a very odd sort of presentation. I'm very pleased with music.
I'm a geologist as well, so that's why I always get the reservoir questions.
Any last minute questions?
Yeah. Talk a bit about how this moves oil and gas.
So,
So I understand it's 60 years of CO2 as a plant.
Do you want me to take that question?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're doing something called porosity and permeability. So I want you to imagine a Coke, a glass of Coke that you get from McDonald's, and they fill it completely full of ice, and then they put the Coke in, and Coke is, so the ice represents the pool spaces, and then the Coke is basically the oil. So when you suck out and you finish, you know how there's always a little bit of Coke down the bottom? So if I was to then inject water, something heavier than the Coke from below, it would then push up, wouldn't it, that Coke down the bottom, and it would go through all of those ice cubes and around it, and it would come up to the top. That's basically enhanced oil recovery. So reservoirs at first gush out of their own steam. Then they lose that pressure, reservoir pressure, and they have to be helped. You can use water, you can use CO2, and in fact, these big projects, Schleppner, Schnurvit, and even some enhanced oil recovery from the Ekofisk field in Norway, all use that. And in fact, they use CO2. The Schleppner's been going since 1996.
So what's the...
So so to give you an idea, Schleppner went from 24%, which is about the average recovery rate we would get in the reservoir here. I think Schleppner is at about 70% now.
Wow.
Ekofisk was originally 19%, and then it had a well workover. They used water originally. They're now going to use CO2 and water. That'll go from 17% on a 4 billion barrel field. So you're looking at about 1 billion barrels recovered. It'll be 75%, 78% by the time they're finished in 2050. So you're talking an extra 2 billion barrels of oil recovered just from one field.
75% of all CCS, CCUS projects in the world are enhanced oil recovery.
And that's why the technology is actually quite advanced, because we use it.
Do you ever think you'll have CCS onshore?
Absolutely. Look, for Australia, Australia's got the best basins in the world. And the reason for that, because Australia is the oldest continent in the world. We have got the most beautiful basins in the world. I've done a lot of work onshore. The Panuka Basin in the Territory, some of the area of Bukaramanga, which is the centre of the dish, if you like. Australia is a big dish, a big sort of bowl. And those reservoirs in the middle are just gorgeous.
What do you think of some of the fears that people have about the adaptation?
Can we,
Oh, sorry.
sorry.
Yeah, we can talk
Can we
about
take this offline and discuss it morning tea? I just want to keep this on track. Can we just thank Natalie for wanting to go through? And our next speaker is Professor Wilson from Dartmouth College, who's going to be talking about offshore wind, and she's also been doing some work with the Denmark Technical University. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm at the National Wind Research Laboratory at DTU outside of Copenhagen. But I actually came to Australia 14 years ago on CCS. And so my PhD looked at the regulatory and legal context for carbon capture and sequestration. And so for me, the idea of admissible flow and water and gas, and I mean, this was technology developed in the 70s to get more oil out of the reservoir. So
Exactly.
yeah, and I for years I kept working on CCS, and I got tired of what I called PowerPoint plans. where we would have lots of projects. I mean, Snowbit was injecting, Sliker was injecting, but nothing else was happening. And so I started studying wind. And then I started studying transmission grid and like how the systems come together. And now with offshore wind, I feel like I'm making a full loop. And this conference for me feels like, sometimes your life loops back on itself. I just want to thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. I got interested in offshore wind. I am not a trained lawyer, but I write a law textbook with some really smart lawyers. Lincoln Davies is the dean at Ohio State. Alex Glass is right now with the administration, which is moving to University of Michigan. Hari Sosky is the dean at Western of the U.S. None of them were deans when we started writing law textbook. That also happens. Like you work with normal people, and then they get older and they do crazy things. And I am now at Dartmouth. I just finished an administrative page running their Energy and Society Institute, and in stepping down and saying, what is the most interesting thing to focus on right now? When we were updating the third edition, I was updating offshore wind section, and in North America, all of the projects are financed by European money. Why is this? And so we had a workshop with our colleagues at Columbia and ETU, where we explored the challenges of offshore wind finance with the practitioners. There's very few people in the world who can actually bring these deals together to make offshore wind happen. Rule of thumb, this is not correct, but rule of thumb, 1 gigawatt, $3 billion US. Just to like help me. And a lot of the projects going in are like gigawatts. And so when we're thinking about financing for renewables versus our fossil assets, that first cost and that finance cost drives everything. And so for those of you who care about renewable energy technologies, what you really care about are interest rates. What you really care about are depreciation. I mean, all of these pieces here that drive first costs for onshore wind, future finance costs, about over 30%, and your CapEx costs for offshore wind, it's about 65% of your cost of first cost. But remember, these are big numbers. And most people can put up a solar plant. My mom can do it by making one phone call and getting one on the roof in Southern California. Here in Australia, everybody and their brother has a solar panel on their roof. But offshore wind is hard. It's really complicated. And when we're thinking about this technology, yesterday we had the talk on swaptions that looked at how do we take in our liberalized electricity markets and make those volatile prices financeable by giving kind of a using contract for difference or others. So there's a lot of mechanisms that we use. So that's why I got interested in this in the first place. And so when my sabbatical came up, I decided to spend some time in DT Wind, where there are 400 people working on wind. And there's reasons for that in Denmark, but when we're thinking about offshore wind resources, the global resources are wind. And yet today, the technology remains widely deployed only here in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. That's Japan. And so when we're really thinking about how the projects are coming together for the rest of us, that's become the focus of my sabbatical project. So I've been able to visit Vietnam and Taiwan and Philippines, and now I'm here, mostly to learn from you and understand what the context is for offshore wind. But I just wanted to share a little bit kind of globally, how we're thinking about this. How many of you think about offshore wind on a weekly basis? But for the rest of you, it's actually really interesting technology that fits together puzzle pieces in very different ways. And what I've appreciated is that, and Tim mentioned this yesterday, a few years ago, they were telling the guys they were crazy. And now there's projects kind of happening. So we'll see. So IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association, projects that for net zero, by 2030, we're going to need 270 gigawatts of offshore wind globally. By 2050, 2000. Today, the Global Wind Energy Report for 2023 just dropped yesterday. It's fresh, guys. Good to share with people. Maybe bring it to your dinner party. 64.3 gigawatts globally. Again, most of that is in Northern Europe and China. The US, we're finally getting started. And when I started looking at wind 20 years ago, There was a project proposed called Vineyard Wind that never happened. And the US is kind of inspired by that going forward, but today I'll talk to you a little bit about where we are. So why offshore wind? Really the promise is scale. A lot of the renewables we can do on land, with the exception of Australia, right? You have land. Taiwan doesn't. Vietnam also harder to find. Coasts of the US, where a lot of our demand is, also more difficult. But the high capacity factors are really what make this technology 50–60%, something that makes it operate very differently than a lot of our land-based wind, which has capacity factors 20–40%. So you can think about 40, 50, 60% for some of our offshore capacity factors. The costs in our zero interest rate environment that we've had the last decade have been driven rapidly down. We're now in the latest European wind shore auctions, wind is bidding in without any sort of subsidy. It's still using CFDs to kind of give a levelized price for the finance, but they're bidding in without that. And sometimes even in that. And within Europe, we talked yesterday about the energy crisis, and living in Denmark this year's been cold. They set all offices at 19 degrees. And it's been a time when people see energy for the first time and it really matters. All my colleagues are on the radio every other day because this is a big topic. And so offshore wind is now seen as part of these energy hubs or energy islands where they're talking about not just hydrogen, not just wind, but they're calling it power to X. That's their way of talking about all of the products electrification. And this idea of having 10 gigawatt interconnected offshore wind hubs that are interconnected to many different European countries, producing many different products, linking with pipelines and shipping industry, and really transforming society. So I would say the Russian war in Ukraine has driven EU energy policy in ways that are absolutely fascinating. Here's some of the essence. There's a really nice paper in Nature that talks about, what in 2015 we, the experts, thought the prices would do, and then what they actually did. Right? So we, the experts, are usually wrong, and I have a quiz for you later on, so pay attention. And then the component of here's what we're expecting happening with offshore wind. Here's floaters in the future. A lot of Australia's floaters. So here's the project, kind of goals globally, right? So here's the ambitions of all of these countries by 2030. Here's what they have on today. And what has struck me was how hard this technology is and how we have, wait for the picture that gets excited.
Loving it. I love this television.
And the Renewable Consulting Group came forward, like, of all these targets, they've seen only 3 of the countries on target to meet them. And having just been to Vietnam, I'm actually not sure that's going to happen for Vietnam anyway. And so maybe our job as public policy people, as people in the space, is to have targets and use those as a way to move forward. You can argue that they do a good job of signaling to industry that this is serious and we should train your people, to students that this is good, we should invest, to financial people that maybe we're not just a bunch of kooky clowns. But what I've appreciated, having studied onshore is just all the different pieces and interests that come together here. So I took a class at DT Wind. I would recommend as a professional to always take a class of every few years just to cultivate humility. Because the students are so much better. And what they do in this class is they have a wind energy master's degree. They give you this model called WASP. This is what the developers use. It gives you wind rows, you have different sites, you look at the different projects and plants. And so what does a developer care about? The first thing they care about is access to transmission. Transmission. You can make all the energy you want, but if you're not able to sell it, it's actually not very worthwhile. And then they'll look at the resources, and then the access to rights. So the maritime spatial planning, the ability to use this thing like we talked about before with the petroleum law, is kind of exclusive territories that you can manage. 30 years plus with the renewal. The environmental impact assessment ends up being a foundational document for bringing together what the project is going to work out. It takes years to do. How it will impact the marine environment, the local communities, all that consultation is happening in those documents, how it will be decommissioned, and then how to get a bankable project. What types of mechanisms am I using with my off-taker, with my state, with others? How are you securing financing? And what I have appreciated more and more is the ability of the developer to run through, like we were talking about with CCS, a regulatory, legal, and institutional framework that is not designed for this. And by the end project, it is possible that it will get easier. The Danes love to talk about one-stop regulatory shop. So I just walk into Penny, hand her my project, she just hands me back all my permits. It takes a little while, but she's actually still in the background talking to the defense ministry, but my job as a developer is a bit. But that's not how it works in the US. I'll show you in a second. So you're thinking about the transmission rights, Star of the South, which I would argue is your one kind of non-just PowerPoint offshore wind plant here and outside of Victoria. They have those transmission rights from that whole plant. And that's probably one of their most valuable assets. In Europe, they've done a really good job of marine spatial planning. Who are the marine users? Who are the marine users? Who does have access? Who doesn't have access? What are the existing interests? Fisher communities in some parts of the world are really super important. In Norway, they really drive the show. The
Norwegians are obsessed with fish sets.
Norwegians love fish. They're people of the salmon. It's true. They're people of the salmon. You have to. Got your markets. They got their fish. And then the EIA piece is really a part in the whole development phase of this come together. It can take 3 or 4 years. Actually, do a good EIA for one of these projects. And if you have a question and answer period, some funny stories, ask me about the Swedish one. For the bankable project, the swap talk that we heard yesterday did a really good job of talking about why we need this for renewables. And then the social license to operate. And I said the ideal kind of one-stop shop. But this is all negotiated. And one of the things I really appreciated about Star of the South project, which is funded by Copenhagen Infrastructure Project, the one that's doing Vineyard Wind, that's scheduled to come on in the US this year, we think. Their website's beautiful. I mean, when you look at all of the marine engagement and research they're doing and meetings they're having with all of those community members, it's pretty best practice in my book. I mean, there's just someone who studied how some of these projects flail on their own inability to talk to the neighbors. They've really done a good job.
I think it's interesting considering the legislation that's actually applied.
And the billions they've spent off the back of their own, being pioneering in their ecosystem space studies.
I think they're trying to set the bar.
Yeah.
And so other things you need, supply chain. Some countries have actually used a supply chain issue to require local content in Taiwan. A workforce that knows how to work on this. I mean, these are jobs. Well, all of us do. It's not just Australia. This is a complicated industry. We all need to learn if we're going to do it. The ports, the maritime. So this is, we went to visit this, in Denmark, they have an offshore wind test site. If any of you guys come to Copenhagen in the next year, just shoot me out and I'll see if I can get you over there. It's an amazing place. So that the Vestas 15 megawatt test turbines and everything. When I was there, the Siemens Gamesa 14.2 megawatts. It's as tall as the Eiffel Tower, right?
14.2.
It was for the Vestas, I think it was 14 point something.
They're built.
Yeah, I mean, it's the test site. It's the test site. And now the Vestas is 15. The Siemens was at 14.2 or something. And so they're as tall as the Eiffel Tower. The blades are 132 meters. So, and then the idea of a port infrastructure. And oftentimes we think about the depth that we need for vessels to come in. We don't often think about the need for storage space for all of the foundation pieces and the blades. And so if you do come visit me in Denmark, like I said, you're all invited, you'll see in Esbjerg the blades lined up, the tower section, then the cells. I mean, the cells are as big as like a house. So So this idea of storage and having the space for it in a lot of countries is really hard. They may have the ports, they may have the depth, but they don't have that easily accessible space for the storage. And then this is the one that's out for one of the first US projects, the different ship infrastructure that we need to actually construct. So there's a whole set of ships and ports that we need for the construction process, and then a whole set that you're going to need for the operation and maintenance process for the next 30 years. Different needs in terms of these kind of jack up ships that go out there and then they jack themselves up to be stable. So this is for shallow water fixed bottom systems, kind of up to 70 meters now. If we have floaters, it's going to be a different configuration.
So they're the equivalent of jack-up rigs and the one that's.
I think they're close.
They are.
Exactly. And seeing them moving these big things and putting the pieces together for, at 300 meters.
And you were talking about floaters before, I'm assuming they're the same.
It's a little bit different. So here's the turbine size. You can just have some idea of the scale. So here's an Airbus 380. So this is actually his future, but these 15 megawatt turbines, they're the ones that we have today. Right? And when you order and make a project today, your project takes about 10 years to build. That's another metric, 7 to 10 years. And so you can't order the turbines that are being built today. You order the turbines that are being built today. You catch a ball, where the ball's going to go.
China just announced a 18.
Yeah. And so here's what it looks like in Europe. This is the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, and all of these areas in the marine spatial planning of where they see these technologies going. Their goal right now is roughly 400 gigawatts of wind to be built out. And the system currently is about, I think about 30 right now. So with the EU, one of the pieces I've appreciated is this conversation kind of beyond now the North Sea and the Pacific. So that's been hard, thinking about how that's going to work and what projects are there. The first French projects are kind of coming on now. In the US, President Biden announced a goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030, 15 gigawatts of floaters. And then the individual state goals that I'll show you in a second add up to about 40 gigawatts. So again, we have goals in spades. And then kind of the project pipelines we have. Some of these are PowerPoint. We've all lived with before. This came out January 23, where the member states are signing up to kind of expand this even more. So instead of that 60 gigawatts, now it's about 111 by 2030. So 4 times what we have today. By 2040 more, and by 2050. And the way they were able to think about this, I think for all of us who think about integrated energy system planning, was interesting, was because they were talking about transmission. Well, can you do that without the UK? It's what? As the UK is no longer counted in that. Like, how the heck are they achieving that target? There you go. It's all transmission.
And transmission. Yeah, the new reason. Yeah.
Have you spoke to the island that's being built?
The energy hubs. Everyone had their favorite energy hub. I think the Dutch are the first thing. The Danes had one too.
Yeah.
We spent a lot of time at DTU talking about the energy island, and the regulatory issues are fantastic. Right? Like, how do I price electricity going to this market and this market, but not to the member states? How do you think about that? It's really a fun problem set. Yeah, lawyer.
It's international waters. No regulation.
Well, it's going though, right? So it's a really fun place to be thinking about what is the frontier of this technology. And then I come back to my country. We have beautiful offshore wind resources. I mean, look at this. I live right now right here in Vermont, right next to the New Hampshire border. To get high enough to be able to see over those. You and Sarah Palin.
Maybe you don't want to say that.
So everything on the West Coast is going to be floaters. So this is a floater conversation. We can do fixed bottom here. And Gulf Coast, Louisiana, very enthusiastic. Texas, not so much. So you have like really different state attitudes. It's what?
Any movement down in
Yeah. I think the auction's coming up this year for that one. And so here's the state goals that are kind of driving it, right? Because this is still a technology that's expensive. Oh, one thing I should add. So like Australia, we have state regulation for electricity. And so when I used to live in Minnesota and moved to Vermont, my electricity prices here are about 2 times what I used to pay. So New England prices are really expensive. And so in some ways, offshore wind is expensive, but not that much more than we're already paying in that system. California also really high electricity prices. So here's the goals of the states. So, they have their renewable energy goals, and they've made specific offshore wind goals. This idea that we need to provide a specific target. Yes?
So what's the next?
That is a very good question. So a lot of them are legislative goals right now. So we said our goal is to have this much right here. How they actually get made, I spent a lot of years when I was doing my early onshore wind stuff. Massachusetts had beautiful goals. They never made them. Texas had no goals, and I'm going to show you pretty soon.
It's not the state.
It's not the state what?
It's not the state.
No, but they're signaling that they will sign, in Massachusetts example, a PPA with you to negotiate those prices. So, and then California has the goal 2 to 5 gigawatts by 2030 of floaters. This is a state that is notoriously hard to build anything. And then 25 gigawatts of floaters by 2045. We're the only West Coast state with a goal. There's other areas that I'll show you pretty soon. So here's the projects today. We're talking about the projects. So in New York, there's a lot in the planning stage, permitting stage. There's a few that have been approved that are being built, just to give you some idea. This is about a year old now, but it gives you some idea of kind of the stage of building. So the transmission planning story that we talked about in Europe, there's an DOE's Atlantic transmission study that's going on, but it's done by NREL, and the whole consultative part that we talked about here being so important hasn't happened yet for us. And what you really worry about is if we're going to build this to scale, there's only a few injection points in the grid. Remember what you care about, number one? What is it? Transmission. Good. I want you to feel the coming. So number one is transmission, right? And so when you look at all the injection points on the coast, there aren't that many. And so we really do need to coordinate if we're actually going to make this. And right now we don't have the mechanisms for doing it. So here's the auction lease areas that were out here. This is the east coast of New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. So these are the first leases. New York Bight, which is out here, made the news last year because they put out these areas, BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, put these areas and let people bid on them like the UK does. And it was like $4.73 billion. Now, there's an interesting paper that I want to write about, this goes to the US Treasury, but it's the ratepayers that are going to pay for it. So is this like a takings issue that we can think about? So if anyone wants to help me think that one through, I have some other colleagues. So here's like South Carolina, North Carolina. Here's the West Coast ones that are out here. The West Coast auctions, that's another thing that they're looking at. We're kind of figuring out where in the Gulf Coast is. So the technologies for the shallow fixed bottom are pretty set. We have the monopile, we have the jacket foundation. I think Star of the South is using jacket foundations here in the South. But the floating technology race is still on. So Department of Energy just announced their big floating wind shot to lower those costs by 70%. This is part of that kind of IRA big push that we heard about yesterday. But this is 5 of the 7 turbines currently active in US waters today. We have 42 megawatts, guys. We're starting with a very low baseline. So don't let the hype cycle get ahead of the reality in this one. These are in Rhode Island, Lock Island. People go there and fish. It's very popular. That's it. You can see a 5 of the 7. And when I was in Vietnam, and there was a consultant coming saying how the U.S. now has one-stop shop. We're like, what is he talking about? Because this is who you have to talk to if you want to build a project. They've put Bessie Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, honestly, I had never heard of before the announcement was made that they're now in charge of offshore wind stuff. But there's still state level stuff, there's still local level stuff. One stop shop, push a button and go. Yeah.
Are you expecting it to change now that Ira's going to spend $800?
Oh, yeah, because regulators at the state level and federal level, we love to work with each other.
American politics.
So, okay, now it's a quiz. Is everyone ready? Okay, so it's actually a little bit higher now. It's going to add 8 megawatts to this. The number just came out yesterday. 8 gigawatts. So in the US right now, we have about 147 onshore gigawatts of wind. And remember, I mentioned Texas. What is it? There's tons of wind. You have Midwest, where most of our onshore wind is. Just in 140 gigawatts. And somebody yesterday, Meredith and Tim, mentioned the annual energy outlook that every year the US puts out to kind of project the next 20 years. What is that mix going to look like? Well, back in 2000, they did this too. So December 1999, the annual energy outlook came out. They gave us 2,000 onshore wind was on there. How much do you think it said we would have in 2020 for offshore wind? Offshore wind? No, onshore, I'm sorry, onshore. 800 megawatts? You know the answer is 147 gigawatts.
I said 8,000.
8,000, because who says A? Who says B? Who says C? Couple of people. So this is the experts, right? It was A. So we, the experts, were wrong, and badly wrong by over 2 orders of magnitude. So basically, you don't need to listen to any of us. That's how free you're going to be in 20 years, guys. And when we studied what actually happened, in the model that we talked, they were all looking at these costs. They said you couldn't build up more than this, you couldn't have more than 20% of wind on your grid because you crashed the system, right? We've really created in the last 20 years kind of a socio-technical system. Control systems have changed from wind turbines to wind plants. And now wind plants and their interactions with each other. The wake effect is real. Policies and incentives at the local, state, and federal levels, people getting more familiar with this. Finance, comfort, and risk management. My colleague Toby Schmidt at ETH Zurich has looked at all the German wind projects and looked at how the cost of finance has come down. So much for that rational banker idea, right? I mean, the costs come down when they get more experience like the rest of us. You also have these associated systems, like weather and met data, or if you go to any grid operator, you see the big weather patterns coming in and they're better at projecting the wind. They've created new market rules that let wind bid into the market like any other asset, true up and controlled. Before I'd have to call you up and say, Ann, dispatch down. And then call you up when you could come back. Now that's all automated because wind has gotten bigger. And then lots of new transmission. Billions of dollars in transmission all over the country to enable these wind resources to be part of this. So, yeah.
What was the impact on its perception of wind energy after the distraction problem by ERCOT in Texas in winter of 2022?
Yeah. So first you have to appreciate that the grid, I have a slide later, I can get the number of it. So Texas operates its own market.
Yes, the ERCOT market.
And ERCOT has separated rules from the rest of it. There was a 2011 report telling them that they should have actually windtrized all those gas operations. Wind was vindicated as it wasn't caused by wind.
Yeah,
it was caused
gas.
Yeah, exactly. And so what happens in Texas, I don't want to say it stays in Texas, but you know, they have made decisions not to treat their system well. And when I go to the Austin Electricity Conference every year, you know, here you're talking about reliability, affordability, and accessibility.
Yeah.
There they talk about God, markets, and air conditioning. And I'm like, maybe you wouldn't be God if you just fix your thing. Anyway, so we didn't really unpack the conversation. as part of this sabbatical trip, I'm trying to understand how the context for this technology are really different. So beautiful maps, Taiwan, Philippines, here's Vietnam, and here's Australia. I mean, you have amazing offshore wind resources. And here you can do some of the fixed bottom ones down in the border. That's going to be kind of the first way there. And Star of the South, which I mentioned before. So here's Victoria's goals. Not really what you would call a huge pipeline, guys. Remember, you're far away and you don't know. And here's where the area is, for those of you who are okay. And the transmission line, like I said before, is really the value of that project.
There's actually a bid out at the moment for the Hunter region for offshore wind.
Yeah.
And that's not big budget.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's just like your next step. And right now, actually, for those of you CCS people, Sleipner, the Highland 3, the former project there, it's going to be the floaters to electrify the oil platforms. Right? And so this idea of floaters to electrify oil platforms to perform CCS, I mean, that's a technological configuration that is interesting politically because you're bringing on groups that may not have been in bed together before. But, you know, they talk about that environmental group. Here again, we have the CMA, same regulator, and how this is working out. But I really would love to learn from you. I can tell you how that's working. What surprised me as someone who's worked in the sector for a long time and has thought about how hard offshore wind is, that the state of Victoria considers it easier to develop a whole new industry from scratch with something they've never done than build interstate transmission in Australia. Again, highlighting to you that our constraints are self-imposed, our logics are limited, and we often don't do the easy thing, but that they saw this as a 60 to 75% cost premium, I just found that's true. So help me understand just what is really special in your mind about this context for offshore wind development. I've been so lucky to have the conversations.
I'm giving you a presentation later.
Excellent. See, this is why we're here.
As is to Nelson.
Yes.
So after morning tea, that's one of the things that we yeah.
But I just wanted to kind of situate what's happening here in the world.
What's so special? We have claims regulation.
Claims regulation.
Claytons, which is an Australian term for, there's a drink called Claytons, which is the drink you have when you're not having a drink because it's non-alcoholic, like non-alcoholic scotch. So we have Clayton's regulation, which is the regulation you have when you don't really have regulation.
Yeah.
So all the things that we've mentioned today, like environment and marine spatial planning, are not on it. And wait till you see safety.
Well, and I've appreciated that today to drive a monopile solution, right? Even with like the bubble technology. And that you couldn't actually develop most of the oil and gas sector if they had to go with today's rules. So it's a really interesting kind of time to think about what role this technology. Anyway, so
Can I just flag one thing that I looked at? So offshore wind actually is more likely to have fatal accidents and serious accidents than petroleum because it would be safety standards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in our legislation.
I wrote a paper on it.
Yeah, in our legislation, they've actually got lower safety standards than offshore.
And there's 5 different bits of it that are really ugly. Some bits count, some bits don't. Well, apply this, we won't. And if you're going to transfer from a ship to a turbine, don't fall because actually you're not covered by any rule.
Yeah.
Like you think I'm joking, don't you? I'm not joking.
Yeah, no.
And you know what?
I reckon OH&S will cover you, but apart from that.
But it doesn't because because OH&S Act, the Workplace Health and Safety Act, Commonwealth doesn't come on, so it doesn't start until you're on the facility. And the Maritime Safety Act is when you're on the vessel and when you are transferring and you fall down, which by the way, that's how people die. There is no act to cover it because there's
So a lot of these big 15 megawatt turbines, and the cell's about as big as this room, and they have a helicopter paddle.
and they're really dangerous.
Oh, of course.
And wait till they start producing the most volatile substance on Earth, hydrogen.
Hydrogen.
They are.
Yeah, I know everyone's thinking about it, but when you look at those numbers, no one's made a business case to me that actually.
No, they're the ideal.
Great. Thank you. Let's continue this discussion at morning tea. I'm going to bring you all back really strictly at 11:20. So
management, come on.
11:20, we're back here because we've got a full session after morning tea.